I'm going to kick things off. Welcome to the OPC's book night for Stephen Baker's crime thriller, Donkey Show. We seldom have book nights at the OPC to discuss a novel, but Donkey Show revolves around a code for cast of journalists on the border between Texas and Mexico, so we thought it would be fun. Steve and I go back a long way. He started his career at the Black River Tribune, a small weekly paper in Ludlow, Vermont. A few years later, I worked at the same paper. My memories are typing the copy on strips of paper the size of a column that one of the staff measured out and cut with a paper cutter and then glued to the page. And we also had to set the margin on the typewriter to not go wider than the column of paper. The paper was printed at a daily newspaper's print shop an hour away in New Hampshire. After we put the paper to bed, at least when I was there, I had to drive to the printer, wait there for a couple hours in the middle of the night while it was printed, pick up all the bundles, and on the way back, drop off copies at country stores along the route, collecting the money, the cash from paper sales. We could not get our paycheck until we deposited the cash at the paper's account at the local bank, or the checks would bounce. And as I was talking to Steve before this, I remembered I used to cash it at the grocery store because I was afraid it would bounce at the bank. But enough of that. Steve went on to work in Venezuela and Ecuador and spent a year at the El Paso, Texas Herald Post. He then was hired by Business Week to be the bureau chief in Mexico City. In 1992, he received the OPC's Morton Frank Award for Best Business Reporting from Abroad in magazines for his portrait of the rising Mexico auto industry. He later worked for Business Week in Pittsburgh and Paris, becoming one of the magazine's tech gurus, when tech was the best beat in the world. He's the author of several nonfiction books and another novel. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Patty.
I am going to have a conversation with Steve for about half an hour. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. After about half an hour through, we will take questions from the group. And I'm sure Steve's willing to answer any question you have. So to start off, Steve, could you explain where you got the idea to write Donkey Show and whether it reflects any of your own experiences in Mexico?
Yeah, I always wanted to write a novel. And I went to Ecuador after I graduated from college, and I tried to write short stories like my Latin American heroes, Borges and Cortázar, and they were very, very bad short stories. And a friend was nice enough to tell me that. And so I realized that if I was going to make a living writing, I had to do journalism. That's what led me to the Black River Tribune. And I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And if you want to be a foreign correspondent, you have to climb up to a newspaper publication that can send you to some place. And so I figured I'd do it the other way. And I went to the interesting places and took really not the greatest jobs, but in really interesting places like Venezuela. And when I came back from Venezuela, I thought I had daily newspaper experience and I could be a foreign correspondent. And I learned, no, you actually have to have daily US newspaper experience before you can do that. So I eventually got a job in El Paso. And it wasn't a great newspaper. It was a lot better than the newspaper that I portray in this book. It wasn't a great paper, but it was a place where people could do great work. And I had a lot of great colleagues there. I don't think my work was so special, but I kind of feel bad because I write this book. It's really about bad journalism. And there's so many heroic journalists who are actually dying to bring us the truth, in Mexico especially. And I want to make it very clear that this isn't about them, or this isn't to denigrate the good work that journalists do. But this is about bad journalism. Now, how did I get the idea? When I was in El Paso, there was an incident where a photographer working for the paper, freelance, was over in Juarez, just across the river, shooting taking a picture of a hotel owned by a notorious drug king. And he was abducted by thugs who were working for that drug king, and the drug king was there. And he was beaten, he was mock executed, his cameras were stamped on, and he was sent back to the paper with a death threat for our very, very distinguished Juarez reporter, Terry Papa. And again, I want to make this is not, so what I did, and the newspaper made this into this huge deal because Mexico was not arresting this guy. He was living the high life in Juarez, just a mile down the road from us. And Mexico wasn't arresting him. And the newspaper went on this crusade against Mexico on behalf of our journalist who had the death threat and our photographer who was beaten up. And so I said, this is a really good idea for a novel, except I'm going to change some crucial details. I'm going to take, it's not a good reporter, it's a lazy reporter. And the death threat comes not because he did really great reporting, but because he did sloppy reporting in part. And the reporting is so bad that he gets a death threat. And then you have an interesting situation where a bad, lazy reporter who's nonetheless intelligent has to figure out how to figure out what really happened over there, because it really wasn't the drug king and his people hurting the photographer. It was something else that happened, and he has to get to the bottom of that story.
Okay, that's very interesting. Before I started reading Donkey Show, I didn't know what Donkey Show meant. So I looked it up on Google, and I was a bit surprised to learn its meaning. So I'm going to let you tell us what it means and why you chose that as the title.
Okay. I don't know if this is still true. I was in Juarez, I guess, last year, and it didn't happen to me. But if you were in Juarez or Tijuana at nighttime and you're coming out of a bar, taxi drivers will say, Donkey Show. And the first time I heard it, I thought they were talking about Don Quixote in French, Don Quixote. But what they say is that there's this great spectacle with a sex act involving a donkey. And believe it or not, some people seem to be interested in that. Now, I don't know if there is such a thing as a donkey show, but it's kind of a myth. It becomes this myth where it doesn't really exist, in most cases at least. And they take the poor people that want to see the donkey show from one bar to the next, getting them drunker and drunker and saying the donkey will eventually come. And the cab driver gets a kickback for every drink that this person buys. And so I thought it was interesting because it represents this myth of what people are ready to believe. In our case, in the book, people are willing to believe that a drug lord has a glass eye that he pops in people's drinks, that he has a harem with tigers walking through his house just a couple miles from the newsroom, and that he lives this life almost like 1,001 Nights. And they're willing to believe that. And the newspaper's willing to believe all the stuff that it's publishing. And in a larger sense, it kind of reflects the myths that we accept about Mexico or about any place in the world that we don't know that well, which is we're willing to basically believe what we're told about it. If it fits, if it's convenient for us, if it feels good, we tend to believe it. And this is true regardless of which side of the political divide you're on. You tend to believe because it makes your life a lot easier. You don't have to think about that. That's settled. And so, Mexico is rapists and whatnot, or Mexico is donkey show is real, or this guy pops his glass eye out in people's drinks. And so that's what donkey show is about. It's about the myths that we believe.
Well, that's a good lead in to my next question. I was in Russia for Business Week during many of the same years you were in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And the US was excited about globalization and the rise of democracy in those two countries and others. But as we now know, there was extensive crime and corruption as so-called capitalism took hold. New elites gained fortunes working with government officials, police, and criminals. As you show in the story, investment bankers also were able to game the system. So were we naive when we wrote a lot of positive stories about globalization and democratization in the 90s?
In a word, yes. But there was a lot of truth that we were writing. I mean, it's hard to tell people who weren't around then. It's hard to describe the euphoria that existed after the Berlin Wall fell, and how it just seemed that capitalism and Western style democracy had won and were inevitable and were going to spread. And so NAFTA was born in that era. When I was working in Mexico for Business Week, they had a new president named Carlos Salinas, who was going to be a modernizer. He was basically elected through fraud, but he was going to be a modernizer, and they were in deep debt, and he was going to open up their economy to foreign investment, and little by little. Then he went to Davos, Switzerland, to the Global Economic Conference in 1990, and he saw that the Eastern Europeans were rock stars, because all of the world, they were these new economies that were going to provide cheaper labor and vast new markets to the West. And he realized that to compete with them, he couldn't just open Mexico little by little. He had to cast open the doors and embrace Canada and the US in a full North American free trade agreement. And it's easy to look back on that and say, well, look, it didn't work out. Look at desperate people crossing our border every day. Hundreds of people are crossing, or thousands every day. You can say, well, NAFTA is a failure. I don't really think it was. I think parts of it, I think, like anything, Mexico's a lot more modern than it used to be. Its elections are real now. They didn't used to be. There's a middle class in Mexico that's much bigger than it used to be. So we bought the vision, and a lot of it didn't come true, but some of it did. I'd say that's what it was. And a lot of people took advantage of it in all kinds of ways, journalistically, financially, and all the rest.
Yeah, yes. So I saw a lot of the same things in Russia, and there's not a whole lot I can say right now. Everybody knows what's going on now, but there is a middle class in Russia who, until they invaded Ukraine, lived a pretty good life and kind of made a Faustian bargain. At the beginning, there truly was euphoria. I remember many times I went to several Russian cities where I was the first American. They had been formerly closed military cities, and I was the first American, and they were like ecstatic, to see somebody from America.
Well, just to emphasize the euphoria that was happening back then with regards to Mexico. First of all, the world as we saw it back then, we were getting crushed by Japanese imports. The Japanese had a much more modern and efficient industrial base than we did, and they were killing us in cars especially. And the way many people saw the world was it was going to divide into three global regions. There was going to be the Japan-China region, where Japan was going to use China for cheap labor. We didn't really see China becoming this was right after Tiananmen Square. I don't think people saw China becoming an economic superstar right away. And then there was Europe, where Western Europe was going to have Eastern Europe for labor and an expanding market, and the United States to compete and Canada. We're going to team up with Mexico, and it seemed to follow a pattern that we'd already seen. If you look at it from the point of sort of economic determinism, then after our Civil War, the whole time of Jim Crow in the South, the former Confederate states in our country were an underdeveloped country. They didn't really have rule of law as we appreciate it, as we hope it will be. They had a corrupt one-party system. It was a small elite with a vast underclass that didn't have basic rights. And so when Latin Americans look at William Garcia Marquez, and these Latin American writers look at William Faulkner as a fellow Latin American writer, because he's writing about that. So after the civil rights movement in the United States, when Northern law was extended south, Northern industry followed. Air conditioning helped too. Northern industry followed, and the South became a dynamic part of the modern industrial economy of ours. And the hope was that this march would continue into Mexico. That was the big vision.
As you say that, I have to say, I grew up in Illinois, which was very industrial when I was growing up. And first the jobs went south to the United States, and then they went to Mexico and other countries, taking away the middle class lifestyle of people who could go to high school and then get a job in a factory and have a boat, have a summer house somewhere. And it all seems so long ago.
Yeah, but I mean, that and people throughout the Western Europe too have these fabulous, I mean, that was an unusual time. Between 1940 and 1946, the US had half the industrial capacity of the world, or half the GNP of the world. And so for those years, we could live a little bit beyond our means, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. So I think because we're a club of journalists, we will segue from the economy and go back to journalism. And so the journalists in your book, you touched on this earlier, they make many choices that would be taught as unethical in journalism school. Why did you choose to make them look like bad guys?
Well, first of all, I didn't set out to write this book sort of about journalists and about journalism. Journalism is the story in this book, and it's a lot more interesting if people get into trouble, right? If people have a lie and they've built upon that lie, and then they're caught on that lie, it makes for all kinds of interesting conflict. And so that's what I was much more interested in conflict and storytelling than I was about journalism, frankly. I mean, journalism's really fun, and but part of the reason it's fun is because you have these relationships in a newsroom, and everybody has these embarrassing things in their past and areas where they kind of skated over thin ice, journalistically speaking. And I think it's more interesting where people skate over thin ice and crash. So that's what happens.
Well, when you say that you were interested in conflict, one of the conflicts is between the reporters and editors. And anybody in journalism knows that that is a perennial conflict. So I love the way you showed this in the book. And could you describe some of these relationships and why you chose to write them that way? Like there was the one who was accused of, looking too much at the big picture. He was the anthropologist. He didn't want to get in and ask the dumb questions. The other guy was praised for asking the dumb questions, but kind of didn't know anything else. And it touched close to home to me, or anybody who has been a journalist.
Yeah, well, you have this in journalism, at least when you and I were young journalists working, there was a lot of ambition that people had to move up. They always want to move up. And there's competition among them in the newsroom because you want your star to shine brighter so that you can get from El Paso to Dallas to LA, LA to New York to London, or whatever it is. You want to keep on climbing. And there's this horrible anxiety that you feel as you turn 30. I turned 30 in El Paso, and Holy shit! I am 30 years old, and I'm in a second-tier news market in Texas, and so you feel this competition, and in Donkey Show you have this guy Harley he's really gifted with languages. He can do voices, he can do great impersonations which come into the plot, and he's kind of proud of all of his abilities, but he's lazy.
Mm-hmm.
But he's still ambitious. And then you have this other guy, Duchamp, who is, or not Duchamp, I changed his name, Klinger, who is, doesn't know anything, but he isn't afraid to ask dumb questions. And that's the one thing in journalism that holds a lot of us back, including me, was a reluctance to look stupid. And you have to be ready to look stupid because you have to ask dumb questions. Because a lot of times you don't ask dumb questions, and there's a big hole in the middle of the story because it's something you don't understand. And so Klinger is not afraid to ask them questions. He's not afraid to make people feel uncomfortable. And so he is headed for success, while this more intelligent guy doesn't like him at all and feels intense competitiveness. Just one more thing about this tension you feel in journalists. When you're in a foreign place, or in a place like El Paso, and you want to climb up, and you hear that somebody's coming from the Washington Post or the New York Times, and they want to have lunch with you, this is like, I'm going to impress this person with everything I know, and this person is going to get me a job as a stringer, and then I'm going to use that string, those Washington Post or New York Times clips, to get it to move up. And so these people come to a market like that. Jackson Deal from the Washington Post took me out to dinner when I was in Venezuela and just hit me up for all my sources, and I gave them just eagerly so that I might get a string with the Washington Post. And Peter Applebaum from the New York Times was the Houston bureau chief, and he came to El Paso, and I gave him all of my sources, hoping to get a leg into the New York Times. So this fits into the story too. And
did you succeed?
No, I didn't get either of those strings. I ended up getting a Wall Street Journal string in Caracas that Jose de Cordova, who is a classmate of ours from Colombia and is still a Wall Street Journal reporter. He gave me his string when he went on vacation. So I got some journal clips. That helped.
Well, when you talk about being willing to feel stupid, look stupid, I always thought that helped with learning foreign languages too, because you're going to sound stupid when you're learning a language. And if you can't get over that, you're never going to be good in a foreign language.
That's right.
But all the children in Russia made fun of me at the beginning. But so this is a perfect time for you, Steve, to read a passage from the book. So people who haven't read the book, and Chad put the link to the book in the chat, so you can go there to buy the book or just look it up on Amazon when we're done. But please read the book. It's a joy to read. Okay. So Steve's going to read a little bit now.
I've picked the section where Harley, the guy that has the death threat, has gotten a death threat, and he's also been named the lead drug reporter at the paper based on this horrible reporting that he did. But he's got a death threat. He's going to be written up the next day in the Dallas Morning News. He's feeling kind of good about himself, and the paper puts him into a hotel for his own safekeeping. And he enjoys being in the hotel. He lies down on the bed, he turns on the cable TV, and he starts making long distance calls. Now, that's, it's the time. And one of the things that we're going to see in this chapter is two of the characters that are going to appear in this chapter, sort of, are his antagonist at the paper, Klinger, the better reporter who doesn't know anything, and his editor, Canfield, who's his boss. And Canfield's the one who is basically running the coverage. So this is Harley's on his bed, and he's talking. He calls up his ex-girlfriend, his old girlfriend, who lives in Corpus Christi now. He says, "This probably sounds stupid," Harley told her after describing his situation, "but I finally feel like somebody recognizes my abilities." "You mean the drug lord?" Not him. I just mean, well, I told you it would sound stupid. You mean, Cheryl said, that when we went out to West Texas, you expected to be a star. And now, she went on, all these years later, you're finally getting some sort of notoriety, even if it comes with the inconvenience of a death threat. Not really, he said. I mean, one minute you tell me this drug lord had a reporter's lungs ripped out, and next you're telling me that you're finally getting the respect you deserve. If you're getting respect for your death threat, that other reporter must be getting a Pulitzer for dying. No, Harley said. That reporter was Mexican. So? I feel like I called my friend and got the DA. Cheryl showed no pity. Tell me why it matters that he was Mexican. It's an entirely different case. Because he was Mexican? Isn't that what you like about El Paso, that the border doesn't mean anything? You ride your bike to Mexico to buy beer and hot sauce, right? And now you're counting on the border to save your life. I think you should catch a plane. And go where? You could come here if you wanted to, Cheryl said. We have an extra bedroom. Thanks. No, really. I'm not going to run away, Sherry said. You're going to become a real reporter now. Is that what you're saying? I guess. You'll have to work a little harder, cut back on bike riding maybe, stop studying Portuguese or Urdu or whatever language you're into now. He was silent. He stopped flipping channels and was staring at a Roadrunner cartoon. Then he told her about his new beat. Ken made me the new drug reporter today. Oh my God, what's Canfield think about that? He probably thinks it's a riot. Cheryl, who asked him for at least one impersonation per phone call, requested some Canfield, one of her favorites. He gladly launched into a loud drawl. Doggone it, Klinger, I want you to go out there to Fort Bliss and ask some tough questions. You hear me? Harley, when you finish your anthropological pursuits, you might consider finding out what the hell is going on in old Mexico. And when you write that story, I want to see those tigers in the lead. Doing voices lifted his spirits. He said goodbye to Cheryl and wandered into the hotel bathroom, shouting newsroom orders in Canfield's drill sergeant voice. When the phone rang, he ran to it and without thinking answered with Canfield's, hello! Dwayne? It was Hank Klinger, sounding very confused. Harley harbored very few resentments, but everything about Klinger irked him. The young reporter was Canfield's favorite. He was astonishingly ignorant, but at the same time an excellent reporter, probably because he didn't mind asking stupid questions and was perfectly happy to bother people. His ambition was boundless. Harley even found himself objecting to Klinger's haircut, a mullet that crept down his neck in blonde curls. With the bewildered Klinger on the line, Harley decided to stick with Canfield's voice. What the hell are you calling for here, Klinger, you doggone weasel? But you told me to, he added a plaintive, remember? All right. You want to talk to Harley? Yeah, please. He paused, then returned his own voice. Hi, Hank. Hi, Klinger had never sounded so meek. Don't tell me you're working this story with me, Harley said. Yeah, Canfield must have told you. Yeah, now he's raiding my minibar. Hey, he shouted, away from there. Easy on those cashews, Dwayne. They're $2.50 a pop and fattening. He turned his attention to Klinger. So you're working this story with me, but you don't know any Spanish, right? Oh, I know some. How about if I get started tonight looking up Stevenson? That's the photographer that was beaten up. Klinger proposed. Okay, Harley said. Can I talk to Dwayne again for a minute? Klinger asked. Harley didn't feel like bringing back the city editor's voice. Klinger might detect something on a second hearing. He's taking a dump, he said. In your bathroom? Where else? Klinger sounding disgusted, signed off. So his voice impersonations will come into the plot.
Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you, Steve. So I was interested, and we've had a few questions related to this. Could you talk about how and why did you transition from being a journalist to a book author? And what is the difference between writing nonfiction and fiction?
I always wanted to write books. It was my goal always to write books, and journalism was a way to write. And Business Week was a fabulous place to work and to learn and to be with colleagues. And it was a great period of my life, but I did not like writing for Business Week. I did not enjoy the weekly news format. I found it very constricting. And so
I remember you didn't like the Business Week story structure, the writing formula either.
Well,
I remember you chafing against that.
It went like this. Joe is having troubles doing this in this town. Joe is not alone. Indeed, from Patagonia to Alaska, people like Joe are now changing the economy, convulsing whatever. You know, it fit into a formula that I didn't enjoy writing. And so I was always looking for a way out, and I always wanted to write books. So as far as the transition went, I did a cover story at Business Week on sort of the future of the data economy, and I pitched that as a book, and I got a book contract, and I loved the freedom of reporting and writing a book so much more than I enjoyed journalism. And so I was all ready to quit journalism and quit Business Week and do that full time. And then the 2008 market crash happened, and you'd be an absolute idiot to quit a good paying job for anything at that point. So I hung on until Business Week sold itself to Bloomberg. And at that point, I got a little bit of a severance, and I was happy to leave and write more books. As far as fiction and nonfiction, fiction is just more fun because you can just make stuff up. I mean, when I was writing for Business Week, I would have maybe 3 or 4 little turns of phrase in a story that I liked, that I would call my jokes. They weren't really jokes, but they were just little touches that I liked. And I remember I'd go through the feedback the next morning, and I'd say to my wife, none of my jokes got through. And in writing fiction, all of them get through. So what's not to like?
Well, the other question is, now you've been an author for a while. Mm-hmm. So has the economic model changed, to use a Business Week phrase? Like, was it easier to make money before than it is now writing books?
Well, it was easier before the crash. When I sold my first book, The Numerati, Houghton Mifflin sent me on an 11-city tour. And there were people picking me up and taking me to hotels, and it was like from a different age. Now, 2 things have changed since then. One, the market crash of 2008 and the slimming down of publishing spending. They don't spend. And second, my book wasn't a bestseller, and I've never written a bestseller. And so as an author who doesn't write bestsellers or isn't known for it, I can't get the kinds of advances that I could live on just for myself. And so I've gone to writing books for people, or with people, and I get more money that way, and I can make a living at doing that. I just had a meeting this morning with my agent, and I have this and one other guy, a source, and I have this great idea for a book, and it might catapult me to the top again, where I'll get an 11-city tour. But right now, if you're not a best-selling author, it's hard to make it writing for yourself under your own name uniquely.
Okay, so Steve, now I'm going to start asking some questions from the chat.
Okay.
So, well, this is just a comment. Somebody writes, Donkey Show is what Rubio calls the January 6th committee. But somebody else, Paula asks, Paula Dwyer, the OPC president, my question goes to the huge number of murders of journalists in Mexico in recent years. Why so many? Why now? And why can't the government stop it?
Well, first of all, let me preface this by saying that I'm not an expert on Mexico at this point, if I ever was one. And so I've been off the beat for a long time now. And what I say, you take it with a grain of salt. And if Alfredo Corchado was on this call, speak up. I don't know if he is, but he was a colleague of mine in El Paso, and is now now has had a distinguished career writing books and works for the Dallas Morning News in Mexico. So what's happening? Drug cartels control much of the Mexican territory, and they have wars, and that leads to enormous deaths. Like El Paso, Juarez became one of the world's most violent cities. Like, it was more dangerous than Baghdad in the late 2000s, and that's because the war was happening between two cartels. And so if the government can't control the violence because the government doesn't control a whole lot of the country, and that's the sad part. And in this book we talk about a drug lord that he's just a small player compared to the ones today. And they're running governments of a sort. They provide social services. It's very sad. I don't know what the answer to it is, and I don't think NAFTA is to blame. But I will say that there are unforeseen consequences of things like NAFTA. If you bring in the expectation that you're going to clean up the police, then you fire corrupt cops that have been living off a corrupt system. Where are those cops going to work? You've got a bunch of people who are probably going to join forces with whoever's going to pay them. So.
Okay. So Steve Ham asks, the plot is so intricately woven. How did you construct it? Did you map most of it out ahead of time, or did you make it up as you went along?
I made it up as I went along. I started out with the premise that this guy had written a bad story, gotten a death threat, and had to work his way out of it. And then I started writing, because in my experience, if you spend too much time trying to, first of all, you learn about the characters as you write, and they start doing things that you wouldn't have imagined otherwise. So no, I didn't map out too much of it. And I remember coming up with the last, like the final scene, as I was just taking a walk in Portland, Oregon, and it came into my head. And before that, I didn't know how the book was going to end.
So another question is, when you discussed the bad behavior of the journalists in your book, and they were in a local newsroom, how would you describe the state of local journalism today?
Oh, it's horrible. I mean, the whole economic model has died. I mean, I think the big corporations that owned local newspapers were busy killing them even before the internet came around. I think they were firing people and reducing costs and living off the sort of the legacy income from classifieds and other advertisers. And
until
then
Craigslist.
Then Craigslist came and they lost that. And so I'd say we need a new economic model for local journalism. My son, Jack Craver, is in Austin, and he covers local news in Austin, Texas, and has a newsletter, and he sells subscriptions for $100 a year. And so he runs a one-man news operation. And I think a lot of people are doing that. There's a lot of newsletters that are taking off. And it's not the answer, but it's one answer to the covering local news, because there's this huge gap where newspapers used to be. And, local newspapers often didn't do a great job, but a lot of them did a pretty good job.
And another son is also in journalism, is that right? Or no,
Henry
overseas?
Is a photographer. And during COVID, he was all by himself in El Paso. He was covering the border with his photography, and he was locked. He decided to learn Romanian, and that led to he's got a fellowship now to work in Moldova for a year, and that's going to be an interesting place to be. It's surrounded on three sides by Ukraine, but they speak Romanian with a Russian accent.
Well, your comments about newsletters are very interesting, because I started in newsletters at McGraw-Hill before I went to Business Week, as did some others of us. And it was most of them were some energy or health related, and they made a lot of money. And some of them, still exist. And it's kind of full circle. So let me go on with the questions. So Dan Wolford asks, was there a journalism teacher or a mentor who had a big impact upon you at Columbia, or an editor or a writer who challenged you?
I'm sorry to say, I can't think of one, really. I mean,
I think you've always been an iconoclast, Steve. You've gone your own way.
Well, I had a very good professor at Columbia named Richard Baker, and other people got these long end of year summaries of of what they needed to work on and what their abilities were. And what came to me on what could have been the little piece of paper from a fortune cookie, and he just said, stretch yourself. So I guess I learned a lot from him. I think he's long gone now.
Okay, let me see. So Heather Green asks, how did the book evolve? Did it end up similar to the idea you started out with when you started writing?
Let's see. I'll tell you what I had in mind when I wrote this book. I had in mind writing a book like Elmore Leonard's Get Shorty, which is fun. It involves an industry, and somebody comes to that industry and disrupts it. And the person who disrupts everything in Donkey Show is the most talented reporter in the book, and his name is Ruben, and he's a Mexican American who has no place to publish. And I'll return to Heather's question, but I just wanted to say the interesting thing about those times versus this times, and we forget it, is that you needed a friend with a printing press if you wanted a voice. And this guy had nobody who would print his stuff, and so he decides, and the narrative of the book follows Ruben's ambition. Ruben decides that he's going to Ruben has this idea. He's a conspiracy theorist, but a lot of some conspiracies are true. So Ruben believes that the Narcos are in bed with the government in Mexico, and they're in bed with North American industry, and all the powerful players are in bed together. General Motors is directly or indirectly doing business with the Narcos. That's what he believes. And he wants to prove that it's true. And so he goes into the drug business to learn it from the inside. And he has no idea about conflict of interest. He's going to expose it all. And so as far as how the book evolved, I just kept writing, and and figured that if a chapter wasn't good or if it didn't fit, I'd kill it or move it. But you had to keep writing. I had to keep writing 1,000 words a day. And if you keep doing that, you can throw out a lot because you can, like, this book is 90,000 words. That's only 3 months of writing.
So is that how you did it? You set yourself a personal goal of writing 1,000 words a day?
Yeah, that's how I write every book.
Ah, very interesting.
And after I'm done with it, Patty, I feel like I can go out and play golf.
So some days it might have taken longer than others to write the 1,000 words, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, some of them just fly, and some are really, really hard. But if you have to stick to it, and sometimes
just to make yourself do it.
Yeah, you have to make yourself do it and be resigned to the fact that some of it is going to be no good, and you have to throw that out.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to bring up a question I asked you when we were preparing for this that I didn't put in our list of questions, but I told you I noticed, that none of the journalists in the book were women. The women were either girlfriends, wives, whores, or investment bankers who did insider trading, but none of them were journalists. And you said you didn't even notice that.
Well, I didn't think it would be fair to women in a book about bad journalism to include any women. Just kidding. No, I didn't. Confession, I've been working on this book for a long time. And if I'd started it like decades, this book is now a period piece that takes place in a time before there was the internet as we know it, or cell phones as we know it, or social media, and and I wrote it because that was the world I was writing about. And now,
but you did tell me there were women journalists at the El Paso paper.
Oh, we had women journalists. We have photographer, a friend of ours, Carolyn Cole, who went on to win Pulitzer Prize as a war correspondent, war photographer for the LA Times. We had, but the other thing is, and we had, you'll notice that all the people doing work over in Juarez are gringos. They're not Hispanics. And you had this weird situation where some of the Hispanic journalists at the paper who spoke Spanish didn't really want to cover Mexico. They weren't that interested in it. Mexico seemed like they'd rather cover City Hall. They'd rather cover
a powerful beat.
City Hall was much bigger beat than Mexico. And I wanted, and so this doesn't answer why I didn't have women. It just turned out that way. It probably reflects, prejudice on my part that I hadn't even noticed until you brought it up. But
well,
when I was in El Paso, I was just dying to get it. This is a paper. This is one of the only parts of our country where local news covers international relations, and that's what makes it such an interesting place to face the story. You've got a country that's within the same biking route, and I felt like I don't know. I lost my train of thought.
Well, I think the point you were making is very interesting, that it's a local beat that's international without anybody,
Yeah, what I was going to say was I was dying to get an international assignment. I wanted to cover Juarez, and I did some work on a colleague and I worked on a report, an investigative report about judges' sentencing patterns, and that was a success. And as a reward for that success, I got City Hall, and it was the last thing I wanted. I did not want to go to City Hall in El Paso, but there were plenty of people who did. And so in the book, we have the drug lord. When we finally meet Jimenez towards the end of the book, he asks Harley, how come how come you've got all these Spanish speakers in El Paso? How come they send over somebody like you? Because Harley, how come they send over somebody like you to Juarez? And Harley says to him, well, you want to deny the opportunity of City Hall to to people just because their parents were born in Mexico. So that was my feeble attempt. I added it very late in the game.
Okay. So William Wallace asks, what is the state of NAFTA now? It is not in the news much anymore. Also, how are the Narcos going to fare with the expanding legalization of pot in the US? Is the cocaine trade enough to sustain them?
Well, I don't know that much about the drug business, but I think marijuana was always too bulky and too smelly to be the kind of industry that would make them fortunes. You had to fill trucks with this stuff, and it was much easier to deal with fentanyl and cocaine. And I think that's probably true. So I don't think the legalization of marijuana is going to change anything for them. As far as NAFTA goes, I mean, the Trump team renegotiated it, and it's very similar to the old. They didn't change much. They wanted to say that they changed it. It's still in place, and it's still sort of the bedrock for much of North American manufacturing. And it's going to become more important because we're kind of decoupling from China. So we're kind of back to where we thought we were in the early 90s, where we have these regional economies.
Well, going back to the question of international versus local beat, someone suggested it could be called glocal. And do you have any other, I think as a last question, do you have any other thoughts on how your metaphor of donkey show seriously relates to our current situation, the January 6th committee, the difficulty of everybody having their own truth versus pure facts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that basically we've gotten into a world where everybody can choose the myths that they want to believe, and it's extremely dangerous. And as I said earlier, this is not just a left-right thing. We all have. I mean, I have friends in New York who, if I told them that 40 towns in Texas held book burnings, or that kids in Texas go to school with automatic weapons, they wouldn't hesitate to believe it, because they're ready to believe that Texas is an extreme place, because that's one of the myths that some people believe. And so it goes both ways. People and I didn't know this when I was writing most of Donkey Show. I mean, I kind of rewrote it recently, but when I was writing it for the first time, this wasn't happening. I mean, we still had an accepted version of most facts that most people in Congress and in our society accepted, and we had differences on the margins, and now the differences are at the very essence of what we're talking about. And so I didn't write Donkey Show thinking about that, but I think the metaphor holds.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I really enjoyed this. And from the chat, I think a lot of people have enjoyed it. And we hope you have a bestseller on your hands.
Thank you very much. If anybody
and we
in the
look
crowd
forward.
Hi there.
We look forward to your next book.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Patty.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.